You don't belong here. I don't care who your parents think they are. You don't belong here. The words, sharp as shattered glass, sliced through the peaceful afternoon air of Willowbrook Heights. Patricia Coleman stood towering over 8-year-old Katrina Washington, her voice a weapon. The little girl's face was already a canvas of tears. "I was just getting my ball back," Katrina sobbed, her own voice trembling with a fear she couldn't comprehend. How could retrieving her basketball from a flowerbed lead to this moment of sheer terror? But Patricia wasn't finished. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed down at the child, accusing. "Next time," she spat, "you ask permission before stepping foot on my property." The venom in her voice made it clear this was never about a ball or a property line. This was about something much deeper, much uglier. Patricia Coleman believed she held all the power. She believed she was dealing with people who would cower, apologize, and simply disappear. She believed her address, her status, and her assumptions about this little girl and her family gave her the right to speak with such hatred, to lay a hand on a child. She had no idea that everything she believed about power was about to be turned completely upside down. What Patricia didn't know, as she stood there drunk on her own perceived authority, was that a sleek black sedan was already on its way. The person behind the wheel had just received a phone call that would change everything. Patricia Coleman was about to learn that the little girl she had just assaulted wasn't just any child. And her parents weren't just any parents. Let me take you back to the beginning of that day, when the world still seemed normal, and show you exactly how Patricia's carefully constructed life was about to come crashing down. Earlier that morning, 8-year-old Katrina Washington had bounced excitedly in the back of her parents' car as they drove through the tree-lined streets of Willowbrook Heights. This wasn't just any visit to Grandma Rose's house. Katrina adored her 68-year-old grandmother, a retired teacher whose home was a sanctuary of incredible stories and the warmest hugs in the world. "Now remember, baby girl," her mother Diana had said, turning from the passenger seat with a voice that was both gentle and firm. "Grandma Rose has lived here for 2 years now, and she's worked hard to make it her home. You be respectful to everyone, okay?" What Katrina didn't fully understand was who her parents truly were. To her, they were just mommy and daddy. She knew they had important jobs that involved long meetings and serious phone calls, but at 8 years old, the weight of their titles hadn't quite sunk in. Diana Washington, her 36-year-old mother, was the newly elected mayor of Willowbrook City, a former federal prosecutor who had built a career on fighting injustice and commanding respect in every courtroom she entered. And her father? 38-year-old Marcus Washington was the chief of police for the entire city. A 15-year veteran, he had risen through the ranks on pure merit and natural leadership. When Chief Washington walked into a room, people noticed. His presence was commanding, his tactical mind sharp, and his protective instincts for his family were absolutely fierce. But none of that mattered to Katrina as she hugged her parents goodbye. All she cared about was shooting hoops in Grandma Rose's driveway while her parents attended an important meeting on community safety. Little did anyone know, the greatest threat to that safety was much closer to home. Since moving to Elm Street 2 years ago, Grandma Rose Washington had become its heart. The retired teacher had used every penny of her savings and pension to buy her dream house in Willowbrook Heights. She was proud of that house, proud of the life she'd built, and utterly devoted to her granddaughter. Rose was known for her wisdom and kindness, qualities that were about to be put to the ultimate test. But someone else was watching that morning. Patricia Coleman, married to the wealthy businessman Richard Coleman, had appointed herself the unofficial guardian of neighborhood standards. As the head of the Homeowners Association, Patricia ruled with an iron fist, believing her family's old money gave her authority over anyone she deemed a newcomer. From her living room window, she watched the street like a hawk, cataloging who belonged and who didn't. And in her mind, certain people simply didn't belong, no matter how hard they had worked to get there. The stage was set for disaster that afternoon as Katrina played basketball. The rhythmic bounce of the ball, the squeak of her sneakers, the pure joy of a child at play. It should have been the most innocent sound in the world. But when the orange basketball took one unlucky bounce and rolled into Patricia's meticulously maintained garden, everything changed. Katrina approached the property line with caution. She could see her ball resting harmlessly among the flowers. It hadn't damaged a thing. Respectfully, she stepped just far enough onto the lawn to retrieve it, careful not to harm a single petal. But Patricia Coleman had been watching, and what she saw wasn't a polite child retrieving a toy. She saw a confirmation of every prejudice she harbored about the changing face of her precious neighborhood. Her front door flew open with such force it slammed against the wall. She stormed out, her blonde hair catching the sun as her eyes locked onto Katrina like a predator. "What do you think you're doing in my garden?" Patricia's voice was a blade, sharp and cold. Katrina looked up, her eyes wide and innocent. "I'm sorry, ma'am. My ball rolled over here. I didn't hurt any of your flowers, see?" But Patricia wasn't listening. "I don't care," she spat, stepping closer, her shadow falling over the little girl. "You have no right to be on my property." And then she crossed the line. She reached out and grabbed Katrina's small arm, her manicured fingers gripping it roughly. Katrina winced, confusion and fear clouding her face as this strange woman treated her like a criminal. You see, Patricia Coleman wasn't just having a bad day. Her family had built this town on the kind of old money that came from looking down on others, a legacy that ran through her veins like poison. Marrying new money tech entrepreneur Richard Coleman had only solidified her belief that she was the unofficial queen of Willowbrook Heights. For 2 years, ever since families like the Washingtons began moving in, she had been filing complaints, dressing up her racism in language about property values and neighborhood character. Now, standing over this 8-year-old child, she felt she could finally make her point. "Where are your parents?" she demanded. "They're at work, ma'am," Katrina answered, trying to stay polite. "They had an important meeting." Patricia's laugh was cold, cruel. "Probably at work somewhere they don't belong," she sneered. Even scared, Katrina's love for her parents was fierce. "My mommy and daddy work really hard," she said, her small voice gaining strength. "They help lots of people." "I'm sure they do," Patricia scoffed, every word dripping with contempt. Just then, the front door of the house next door opened. Grandma Rose stepped onto her porch. "Patricia, what's going on here?" Her voice was calm but firm, the voice of a woman who knew how to handle difficult situations. Patricia turned on her. "Rose, you need to control this child. She was on my property." Rose looked at her granddaughter, saw the fear, saw her holding the arm Patricia had grabbed. "She's 8 years old, Patricia. She was just playing. There's no need to frighten her." But Patricia was just getting started. "This is exactly what I warned the HOA about," she declared, her voice rising for the whole street to hear. "First, you people move in. Now your grandchildren think they can do whatever they want." You people. The phrase that revealed everything. Overwhelmed, Katrina clutched her basketball and started walking back to her grandmother's house, just wanting to escape. "Don't you walk away from me when I'm talking to you," Patricia shouted, her voice cracking with rage. She lunged forward, grabbed Katrina's shoulder, and spun the little girl around. Frightened, Katrina pulled away. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice shaking but brave. Those 3 words sent Patricia into a fury. How dare this child show defiance? The slap was fast and hard. The sound of her palm meeting Katrina's cheek echoed through the quiet street like a gunshot. "Don't you dare speak to me that way," Patricia screamed. Time seemed to freeze. Katrina stood in stunned silence, her small hand rising to the burning red mark on her face as tears welled in her eyes. The shock of being hit by an adult was worse than the pain itself. "Patricia, how dare you!" Grandma Rose's voice cut through the silence like a sword. She rushed toward her granddaughter, a lioness defending her cub. But the damage was done. Neighbors were emerging from their houses, their faces pale with shock. A car stopped in the middle of the street. Realizing she had an audience, Patricia doubled down. "Everyone saw it," she announced. "That child was trespassing and disrespectful. Someone needed to teach her some manners." But while Patricia tried to justify the unjustifiable, she had no idea that Grandma Rose was already reaching for her phone. She had no idea that the important meeting her victim's parents were attending was about to end very, very abruptly. The moment that slap echoed through Willowbrook Heights, something shifted in the air. "Oh, baby girl, my sweet baby," Rose whispered, dropping to her knees and gathering the sobbing child into her arms. The sight of the bright red handprint on her granddaughter's cheek sent a wave of cold fury through her. "Grandma, I didn't do anything wrong," Katrina cried. "Why did she hit me? Why does she hate me?" The words struck Rose like a physical blow, but she was a strategic woman. Comfort wasn't the only thing Katrina needed now. She needed justice. With hands trembling from anger, Rose pulled out her phone. Click. A photo of the red mark. Click. The tear tracks on Katrina's face. Click. The way Katrina was still holding her bruised arm. Evidence. Then she found the number she was looking for. Diana Washington, her daughter-in-law, the former federal prosecutor who could handle any crisis with calm, controlled fury. The phone rang twice. "Hi, Mom," Diana's professional voice answered. "I'm in a meeting. Can I call you back in an hour?" "Diana," Rose's voice was steady but laced with an intensity that stopped time. "You need to come, now." Someone just put their hands on Katrina. The silence on the other end of the line lasted only a single, terrible heartbeat. In that single, sharp intake of breath, Rose could feel the transformation crackle across the phone line. The composed, professional facade of Mayor Diana Washington was dissolving, replaced by something far more primal, more dangerous. A mother whose child had been hurt. What happened? Diana's voice dropped to a lethal quiet, a tone Rose recognized from the moments just before her daughter-in-law was about to dismantle an opponent in court. Patricia Coleman slapped Katrina across the face, Rose said, her own words precise and clear, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Hard enough to leave a handprint. "I have pictures." Across the lawn, Patricia, who had been trying to justify herself to the growing crowd of neighbors, caught enough of the conversation to understand. But instead of remorse, instead of grasping the magnitude of her actions, she bristled with defiance. "Go ahead, call whoever you want," she announced, pitching her voice for everyone to hear. "I know people in this city, important people. Nothing is going to happen to me for disciplining a disrespectful child." Patricia had no idea she had just made the single greatest miscalculation of her life. She had no idea that the woman on the other end of that call didn't just know important people. She was one of the most important people in the entire city. 15 miles away, in the Willowbrook City Council chambers, Diana Washington sat at the head of a massive conference table, surrounded by department heads and budget analysts. They were deep in a discussion on community safety funding when her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it. This was one of the most critical budget meetings of the year, but something, an instinct, a mother's intuition, made her glance at the caller ID. Grandma Rose. Rose never called during work hours unless it was an emergency. "Excuse me for just one moment," Diana said to the room, her voice even as she stepped into the hallway. The composure she had cultivated through years of high-stakes legal battles and political negotiations was about to be shattered. When Rose finished explaining, Diana's face transformed. Her colleagues, had they seen her, would have said they'd never witnessed anything like it. The professional mask didn't just slip, it melted away, revealing something fierce, protective, and utterly terrifying beneath. "I'm on my way," Diana said, her voice so cold it could have frozen fire. "Keep Katrina safe, document everything, and Mom, don't let that woman leave." She hung up, her hands trembling with the effort of containing the rage building in her chest. Someone had put their hands on her baby. Someone had slapped her 8-year-old daughter. The federal prosecutor in her was already building a case, but the mother in her just wanted to get to Katrina as fast as humanly possible. She walked back into the conference room. Every person at the table could see that something had fundamentally changed. This was not the same woman who had left 5 minutes earlier. "Family emergency," Diana announced, her voice clipped and professional, but with an undercurrent that made everyone sit up straighter. "I have to leave immediately." Marcus Washington, her husband, looked up from the police budget reports. He took one look at his wife's face and knew. This was serious. He had seen Diana angry, had watched her tear apart defense attorneys in court. But this was different. This was personal. "I'm coming with you," Marcus said, already rising from his chair. "Marcus, you don't have to—" He cut her off. "Someone hurt our daughter," he said simply. "I'm coming." The drive through Willowbrook was a blur of controlled fury. Diana's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as she navigated traffic with a speed born of high-pressure situations. In the passenger seat, Marcus was on the phone with Rose, getting the full story. She did. "What?" His voice grew dangerously quiet as Rose recounted how Patricia had grabbed Katrina, the slap, the use of phrases like "you people," making it clear this was about race, not just a basketball. Diana glanced at her husband, recognizing the look he wore when dealing with someone who had crossed an unforgivable line. "That woman has no idea what she's just done," Diana said, her voice steady, but filled with a promise that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. She has no idea who she just messed with. Back in Willowbrook Heights, Patricia Coleman was feeling smug. She had made her point, established her authority. The old woman's phone call didn't worry her. What could a retired teacher possibly do? She pulled out her own phone and dialed her husband, Richard. "Richard, I need you to handle something," she said, her tone self-righteous. "What kind of something?" Richard asked, a familiar wariness in his voice. He knew his wife's talent for creating problems he was expected to solve with money and connections. "I had to discipline a neighbor child who was trespassing," she explained, omitting the crucial details. "Now the grandmother is making threats. Call your people at City Hall and make this go away." "Patricia, what exactly did you do?" Richard sighed. "Just handle it, Richard. It's why I married you." Hanging up, Patricia turned back to her neighbors. She saw the judgment in their eyes and mistook it for support. "I hope you all saw that," she announced. "Someone needed to teach that child some respect." Tom Bradley finally found his voice. "Patricia, she's 8 years old. You can't just hit someone else's child." "That's the kind of thinking that's destroying neighborhoods like ours, Tom." She waved him off dismissively. Mrs. Henderson, who had lived on the street for 30 years, shook her head. "I've never seen anything like this. That little girl wasn't hurting anyone." "Oh, Mrs. Henderson," Patricia said with a condescending smile. "I know change is hard, but someone has to maintain standards." Meanwhile, Rose held Katrina close, whispering reassurances while keeping a hawk's eye on Patricia. "Is Mommy coming, Grandma?" Katrina asked, her voice small. "Yes, baby girl," Rose soothed. "Mommy and Daddy are both coming. They're going to make this right." Patricia overheard and laughed, a real mocking laugh. "Your property value just dropped, Rose," she called out. "The HOA is going to hear about the kind of family drama you've invited into our neighborhood." But Rose just smiled, a calm, knowing smile that made Patricia's confidence flicker for the first time. "Oh, Patricia," Rose said quietly, "I don't think you understand what's about to happen here." Because while Patricia was threatening HOA meetings, she had no idea that two of the most powerful people in the city were racing toward her. She had no idea that the family drama she sneered at was about to become her worst nightmare. The sound came first, the deep, powerful rumble of an engine that cut through the tense quiet of the suburban street. Every head turned as a sleek black sedan, radiating authority, rolled to a precise stop at the curb. The driver's door opened, and Diana Washington emerged. She was a force of nature in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, her posture ramrod straight, her eyes locked on Patricia Coleman with an intensity that could make men confess to crimes they hadn't committed. Every click of her heels on the pavement was a drumbeat of approaching consequence. The neighbors, who had been clustered around Patricia, instinctively parted, creating a path. Patricia, suddenly feeling small, took an involuntary step back. "Miss Coleman?" Diana said, her voice carrying across the lawn with crystal clarity. "I understand you laid hands on my daughter." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "Your daughter was trespassing," Patricia shot back, trying to regain her footing. "I was within my rights." "She's 8 years old." The 4 words, delivered with deadly quiet, silenced her. Patricia's mouth went dry. This was not some flustered parent she could intimidate. She tried to rally, falling back on her prejudice. "Look, I don't know what kind of work you people do, but this is a respectable neighborhood." "What kind of work do you think I do, Ms. Coleman?" Diana interrupted, her voice dangerously soft. Patricia's mind, clouded by bigotry, went exactly where Diana knew it would. "Some city job probably, an affirmative action hire, thinking you can throw your weight around." The silence that followed was absolute. Diana's smile was cold and sharp. "I'm Mayor Diana Washington," she said, her voice carrying the weight of every courtroom victory and political battle she had ever won. "This is my city." The reaction was immediate. Mrs. Henderson gasped from her porch. Tom Bradley's jaw dropped. "Patricia," he whispered in horrified disbelief, "you just slapped the mayor's daughter." But it was Mrs. Henderson who drove the point home, her voice ringing out with 30 years of neighborhood wisdom. "Oh my God, Patricia, what have you done?" The color drained from Patricia's face. That's not... You can't be... Before she could finish, another engine roared to life. This was not the smooth purr of a sedan, but the aggressive rumble of a police SUV. It pulled up behind Diana's car, emergency lights painting the street in strobing flashes of red and blue. The driver's door opened and Chief Marcus Washington stepped out. If Diana's arrival was impressive, Marcus's was overwhelming. At 6'2" in his full-dress uniform, every piece of brass gleaming, he was the very embodiment of law and order. He walked toward the group with the measured pace of a man who expected no resistance, his eyes fixed on Patricia. "I'm Chief Marcus Washington," he said, his voice carrying an authority that made hardened criminals reconsider their life choices. "That's my daughter you assaulted." The word assaulted struck Patricia like a physical blow. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute. Assault was a criminal charge. It meant lawyers and consequences that her husband's money couldn't make disappear. Her breathing became short, panicked gasps. But it wasn't over. 2 more police SUVs arrived, their lights joining the silent, flashing chorus. 4 uniformed officers emerged, creating a professional perimeter. These were not beat cops. They were members of the chief's personal detail, responding to an assault on their boss's child. Patricia looked around at the officers, the flashing lights, and the faces of her neighbors, now staring at her with a mixture of shock, horror, and a dawning, terrible pity. The world she had so carefully constructed, the one where her status protected her, had just collapsed around her. She tried to speak, to explain, to justify, to somehow shrink the enormity of what she had done, but the words wouldn't form. Her mouth worked, yet only small, strangled sounds escaped her throat. Marcus's voice cut through her panic, sharp and clear with the practiced authority of a man whose orders were never questioned. "I need you to witness and document everything that happens here. We're dealing with an assault on a minor, and I want this done by the book." That phrase, "by the book," sent a fresh surge of ice through Patricia's veins. By the book meant no leniency, no quiet considerations for her social standing or her husband's influence. By the book meant she was about to be treated just like any other criminal who had dared to harm a child. Diana moved to her husband's side. For a moment they stood together, a united front of justice and parental fury. Here were 2 people who had built their careers on serving and protecting their community, and someone, on this quiet suburban street, had attacked their child, had laid hands on their daughter, believing there would be no price to pay. "Patricia Coleman," Marcus said, his voice a blade slicing through the tension, "you need to understand the gravity of what you have done here today." Because Patricia Coleman's day was about to become infinitely worse, and she still had no idea just how deep a grave she had dug for herself. The moment had come. Chief Marcus Washington's gaze swept over his officers, the stunned neighbors, and his wife Diana, who stood beside him radiating a controlled fury that could level mountains. Finally, his eyes landed on Patricia Coleman, who was gasping for air as the full weight of her reality came crashing down. Marcus raised a hand. It was a subtle signal, but one every officer on the scene understood instantly. The time for informalities was over. It was time for consequences. Time for justice. "Miss Coleman," Marcus said, his voice resonating with 15 years of law enforcement and the righteous anger of a father, "you are under arrest for assault on a minor." The words struck the quiet neighborhood like a thunderclap. Though everyone had expected it, hearing the chief of police himself speak them with such official finality made it terrifyingly real, sending a shockwave through every person on the street. Patricia's reaction was immediate, a desperate shriek of denial. "This is ridiculous. I barely touched her. You can't arrest me for disciplining a disrespectful child." But Diana Washington stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice was cold steel. It held the precision of a federal prosecutor, the command of a mayor, and the chilling wrath of a mother. "The evidence says otherwise, Miss Coleman." Diana held up her phone. The screen glowed with the photos Grandma Rose had taken. Clear, damning images of a bright red handprint on Katrina's cheek, the tear-streaked face, the bruises on her arm where Patricia had grabbed her. "These photographs," Diana stated, "will be admitted as evidence at your trial." The sharp click of handcuffs locking into place seemed to echo through the entire neighborhood. Officer Martinez, one of Marcus's most experienced detectives, had moved with professional efficiency. Now, Patricia Coleman stood with her hands cuffed behind her back as her neighbors watched in stunned silence. She looked wildly at the faces around her. Neighbors she had tried to impress, people she had assumed would support her, members of the community she believed shared her prejudices. But she saw no support in their eyes, only shock, disgust, and a trace of pity for the spectacular way she had just destroyed her own life. Mrs. Henderson, a resident of the street for 30 years, who had watched Patricia grow from an entitled teenager into an entitled adult, slowly shook her head. Her voice was filled with a sad disappointment. "Patricia, what have you become?" It was then that Patricia began to grasp the full scope of her loss. Her social standing, her reputation, her self-appointed role as the queen bee of Willowbrook Heights. It was all collapsing around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. The neighbors who once deferred to her now looked at her as if she were a stranger. But her nightmare was far from over. As Officer Martinez read her Miranda rights, a sleek silver BMW pulled up to the curb. Patricia recognized it instantly. Richard Coleman, her husband, the man whose tech fortune funded their entire life, stepped out of the car. He looked as if he'd aged a decade in the last hour. Richard had been in his downtown office when his assistant called. "Sir, there are reports on social media. Your wife has been arrested for assaulting a child. The police are at your house." He had dropped everything and raced home, praying it was all a terrible misunderstanding. But the scene before him, the police cars, his wife in handcuffs, the silent crowd, told him this was no rumor. This was a catastrophe. "Patricia, what in God's name have you done?" Richard demanded, his voice trembling with the horror of a man watching his life implode. Patricia turned to him, her eyes desperate, seeing him as her last hope. "Richard, thank God you're here," she gasped. "Call your lawyers. Call your connections at City Hall. They're trying to railroad me over nothing." But Richard wasn't looking at her. He was scanning the scene, taking in the officers, the official vehicles, and the two people standing at the center of it all, radiating an authority that money couldn't buy and connections couldn't touch. "Patricia," he said quietly, his voice hollow, "that's the mayor and the chief of police." The words hit Patricia like a physical blow. But instead of remorse, instead of regret for harming a child, she fell back on a final, desperate plea that revealed the depths of her delusion. "I didn't know who you were," she cried out, her pleading eyes fixed on Diana and Marcus. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. If I had known, I never would have." Diana Washington cut her off. Her words, spoken with crystal clarity, would become legend in Willowbrook Heights. "It shouldn't matter who we are, Ms. Coleman. No child deserves to be treated the way you treated my daughter, regardless of who their parents are. The fact that you think it matters is exactly why you are standing there in handcuffs." Those words landed like a revelation. This wasn't about power protecting its own. This was about right and wrong, about a fundamental truth. No adult has the right to lay a hand on a child in anger. As Patricia was led to the police car, the consequences of her actions began to unfold like a line of falling dominoes. The assault charge was only the beginning. The FBI's Civil Rights Division would soon open an investigation into a possible hate crime. That very evening, the Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Patricia from her leadership position. The fallout spread far beyond her. Richard's company, Coleman Digital Solutions, faced an immediate and ferocious backlash. Clients canceled contracts. Employees began polishing their resumes. The empire Richard had spent 15 years building started to crumble overnight. And yet, in the midst of the wreckage, something beautiful began to grow. The shock of what they had witnessed sparked a transformation in the neighborhood. As the last police car drove away, Mrs. Henderson was the first to approach Grandma Rose. "Rose," she said, her voice heavy with regret, "I owe you and your family an apology. We should have spoken up years ago. We should have stood up to her hatred instead of letting it grow." Tom Bradley stepped forward, nodding in agreement. "She's right, Rose. We all heard the things she said. We were cowards, and that little girl paid the price for our silence." But Rose, a teacher who had spent a lifetime believing in the human capacity for change, simply nodded. "The important thing is that we're all here now," she said gently. "The important thing is that we learn from this, and make sure it never happens again." That conversation led to a community meeting. where neighbors who had barely spoken before began to have honest conversations about creating a neighborhood where every child could feel safe. 6 months later, the Washington family sat around Grandma Rose's dinner table. Katrina, resilient and surrounded by love, had not only recovered, but had become a neighborhood ambassador for kindness and inclusion. Patricia Coleman's story became a cautionary tale told across the city, a reminder that actions have consequences, and that true authority comes not from status, but from character. But more than that, it became a story of hope, a story of how a community can heal from division, and how one terrible day can become the catalyst for a better tomorrow. The Washington family had taken their worst moment and transformed it into a legacy of positive change that would last for generations. And that was the truest measure of their victory. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. We'll see you in our next video.